I sensed it before I comprehended it. A gentle warmth unfurling along my spine, a tingling pulse dancing in my fingertips, and a subtle shift in the air that caused my skin to tighten. It was merely a trivial matter, I reassured myself. One moment, please. Merely an unfortunate incident. Yet, beneath the surface, I was aware. It unfolded on a Sunday afternoon, amidst the familiar warmth of a family gathering, one of those moments that seamlessly merged with countless others. The sound of laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the soothing murmur of voices overlapping in conversation. The aroma of charred meat and freshly mown grass hung in the atmosphere, blending seamlessly with the gentle warmth of the descending sun. My husband stood across the yard, engaged in a lively discussion with his brother, his hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke. I was intimately familiar with his gestures. The way his fingers danced against the glass, accompanied by a subtle tilt of his head as he listened intently. I ought to have focused on him, yet I failed to do so. As I stood in the kitchen, pouring another glass of wine, a sensation washed over me. The figure loomed behind me, so near that I could feel the warmth emanating from his form. So near that my breath faltered for a brief moment. I shifted just enough to catch a glimpse of him from the edge of my vision. The nephew of my husband. It ought to have been insignificant. I had been acquainted with him since his teenage years. Had observed his transformation into adulthood. He was kin. That's the narrative I had consistently crafted for myself. Yet in that instant, with mere inches separating us, everything shifted. He remained silent. He was not obligated to. His gaze held steady, deep and inscrutable, and I sensed he was probing for something. Observing my response. A delicate caress, almost imperceptible. A gentle touch glides over the fabric of my dress, precisely at my waist. It was so ephemeral, so nuanced, that I could easily have persuaded myself it was merely a figment of my imagination. However, I did not. A catch in my breath made my fingers grip the stem of my glass tighter. Initially, I felt compelled to distance myself. To move ahead. To create space between us. However, I did not. In that instant, the peril became clear to me. Since I wasn't appalled. I wasn't repulsed. I found myself devoid of anger. I felt completely immobilized. Free from fear. Not surprised. Yet in a situation much more dire. A sensation that coiled deep within me. Something that caused my heart to race in a manner I hadn't experienced in ages. He paused as well, seemingly anticipating my response. However, I chose not to. And then, just as swiftly as it had occurred, the moment slipped away. He took a step back, creating distance between us, and I finally let out a breath. The surroundings gradually sharpened into clarity. The gentle clatter of dishes, joyful laughter echoing from the garden, and the soft murmur of voices wafting in from the corridor. Ordinariness. Habit. I compelled myself to shift, to advance and set my glass upon the counter. My hands quivered just a bit, yet I brushed it aside. Nothing occurred. That was indeed the truth. It was merely a trivial matter. As I made my way back outside, I could sense his gaze lingering on me. An unspoken connection lingered in the air between us. The conclusion had yet to be reached. The morning unfolded just like any other. Silence. Expected. Ordinary. As I lay awake before my husband, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, I found solace in the rhythm of his steady breathing beside me. The lingering heaviness of the night before clung to me, that fleeting, illicit instant stubbornly etched in my mind. I reassured myself that it was insignificant, that it had been merely a fleeting moment. Yet, the way my heart tightened at the thought revealed a contrasting narrative. I slipped out of bed quietly, navigating the familiar steps of my morning routine as though all was as it should be. The kitchen remained shrouded in a soft gloom, with the first light of dawn gently seeping through the fabric of the curtains. The coffee machine whirred to life, releasing the rich aroma of freshly brewed beans that enveloped me, anchoring me in the comforting embrace of the familiar. This was the essence of my existence. Organized. consistent, soothing. A life that embodies the aspirations of many. As I filled my cup, I settled against the counter, my fingers embracing the comforting warmth of the ceramic. The home was still, with the sole noise being the rhythmic ticking of the clock perched above the sink. My thoughts wandered, despite my efforts to resist, to the way my heart had raced, to the lingering warmth where his fingers had grazed my waist. It was an unfortunate mishap. An insignificant caress. And yet, my body had turned against me, responding in a manner that was utterly unexpected. I dismissed the thought with a shake of my head. I needed to concentrate on the truth, on what was truly important. My husband strolled into the kitchen, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He navigated his routine with a smooth familiarity, pouring a cup of coffee and glancing at his phone as he settled at the table. It was a performance we had honed through the passage of time. Quiet dawns, soothing interludes, devoid of superfluous speech. The simplicity of it should have brought me comfort, the effortless way we came together. Yet, it seemed more like a burden resting heavily upon my chest. I compelled myself to eat, yet the flavors eluded my senses. Opposite me, he flicked through emails, already partially immersed in his tasks. It was a pattern I had grown accustomed to. He was a decent fellow. Committed, trustworthy, the type of partner everyone dreams of. I found no cause for discontent, no desire for anything beyond what we had created together. And yet, an undeniable void lingered within me. Once everything was different, his touch would send delightful shivers down my spine, the hunger in his eyes was unmistakable, and I felt truly desired. Yet, as time passed, it dulled the edges of everything, transforming fervor into ease, swapping immediacy for a sense of knowing. Affection remained, yet it had transformed into a serene, secure presence. I had convinced myself that was sufficient. True love isn't defined by passion, but by resilience. Yet, my mind wandered back to the moment when my breath caught the night prior, to the sensation of being utterly alert in a manner I hadn't experienced in ages. A tight knot of remorse twisted in my gut at the recollection, a piercing reminder that I was undeserving of these feelings. I cast a quick look at my husband. He remained oblivious. He had faith in me, placed his trust in my abilities, and never doubted my commitment. What would motivate him to do that? No reason had ever existed to do so. Up to this point. I slid my chair away from the table, the faint noise almost lost in the serene ambience of the home. I craved fresh air, a moment of solitude, anything to help me find clarity. As I stepped outside, the morning air enveloped me with its crispness, a cold sharpness that ought to have snapped me back to reality. Yet the heaviness in my chest remained unrelenting. The reality was taking hold, embedding itself within me. This was not merely a transient idea, a brief lapse in resolve. It was an entirely different experience, one fraught with peril. Despite my efforts to brush it aside, the truth was undeniable. This is just the start. The celebration had commenced long before, yet it seemed as though I had only just stepped through the door. Time had become an abstract concept, merging into a fog of vague dialogues, the soft murmur of melodies, and the steady chime of glasses meeting. The atmosphere was laden with the fragrance of luxurious perfume and fine wine, as people glided past one another in a graceful, unhurried ballet of social exchanges. I had visited this place previously. This precise moment, this precise cadence. It ought to have evoked a sense of familiarity, perhaps even a soothing warmth. However, this evening, it did not. This evening, there was an unmistakable change in the air. Perhaps I was unique. For the past hour, I found myself weaving through dialogues, offering nods at appropriate intervals, chuckling at punchlines that fell flat. My husband stood beside me, his hand gently placed on my waist, just as it always was during occasions like this. To those around us, we probably appeared to be the ideal pair. Elegant, refined, and consistent. Yet within, a thread was coming undone. His presence was palpable, a sensation I experienced long before my eyes had the chance to meet him. A tug at the fringes of my awareness, a sensation that sent shivers down my spine. As my gaze landed on him from across the room, casually leaning against the bar, a tightness gripped my stomach. I reminded myself to remain calm and composed. I reassured myself that it was of no consequence. I whispered a multitude of thoughts to myself, yet the atmosphere changed instantly when our gazes locked. It was never intended to hold any significance. This wasn't how it was meant to be experienced. I averted my gaze too swiftly, propelling myself into yet another dialogue. A woman I hardly knew was sharing tales of her recent getaway, her voice lively and her hands moving expressively. I acknowledged at the appropriate intervals, savored my beverage, and offered smiles at the right times. Yet, I found myself not paying attention. I was unable to. As I moved, the sensation of his gaze lingered, an unshakable presence that kept me on edge. The intensity of his stare seared into my flesh, even while I feigned indifference. I ought to have departed. I ought to have sought out my husband and remained with him. I ought to have chosen any other course of action than the one I took next. Instead, I felt myself being drawn to the bar, to him, as if an unseen force was guiding my steps. It was not done on purpose. That's the narrative I crafted for myself. Yet my body acted before my mind could comprehend. In that moment, I found myself standing there, just within reach of the subtle fragrance of his cologne, close enough to sense the warmth emanating from him. A server glided by, presenting another glass of wine. I grasped it, primarily as a means to have something in my hands rather than for the purpose of consuming it. I ought to have turned and left. I allowed the silence to linger between us, thick and electric. Then he made his move. Not a great deal. A subtle movement, his fingers brushing against mine as he extended his hand for his drink. Just a hint. Nearly by chance. However, it was not the case. I had a feeling about it. And thus did he. My breath was taken away. I remained steadfast. I stood my ground. In that fleeting moment, the whole universe shifted dramatically. It was audacious. It was an error. And yet, as I finally turned to face him, with my lips parting slightly and my pulse pounding in my ears, I knew one thing with unwavering certainty. This is just the start. I had always taken great pride in my ability to maintain control. Regarding my existence. Regarding my feelings. Regarding the decisions I took. As the days unfolded since that night at the party, I felt myself drifting further away from the essence of the woman I had always known. Initially, it was simple to feign. I followed the routine. Engaging in my work, enjoying moments with my husband, and connecting with friends. I chuckled at the anticipated moment. I paid attention when necessary, and I carried out my responsibilities as though everything remained the same. Yet in those hushed instances, when solitude enveloped me, his memory remained, a gentle echo in my mind. Like a persistent annoyance that eludes relief. The idea of him had lingered for some time. This wasn't the first instance where I had observed something intriguing about him. He possessed a subtle yet profound depth. A distinct edge that contrasted with my husband's laid-back demeanor. He had outgrown his childhood. He's not the same boy I once knew years back. He had transformed into something entirely different. A person who effortlessly quickened my heartbeat. And now, following that moment at the party, I found myself unable to resist the allure he held over me. It began gradually, like a gentle mist, enveloping my thoughts at unexpected moments. As I stood at the sink, scrubbing the dishes. During my solitary moment in the bathroom. Even while I was seated beside my husband on the couch, engrossed in the television. Attempting to concentrate on the display. My thoughts would drift away. And there it stood. The portrayal of him. The shadows lurking in his gaze. The lingering intensity of his touch remained etched in my memory. I lost all sense of control. At times, I found myself thinking that I was being utterly absurd. I realized it was time to let it go from my mind. I possessed all that I desired. All that I required. Yet those instances were brief, while the majority of the time I found myself engulfed by it. The longing was ever present. Stewing just out of sight. drawing me closer in ways I couldn't articulate. The subsequent occasion I encountered him was at yet another family gathering. The gathering was intended to be laid back. An uncomplicated evening meal without any preconceived notions. Yet, the instant he stepped into the room, I sensed it. This constriction in my chest. An unsettling excitement that lingered within me. This time, he was not the same. There was no delicate caress of the fingers. No unintentional looks. In this moment, he was aware of the connection we had shared. And I could perceive it in the way he gazed at me. It had become a contest now. I was unaware of who initiated it. Who had crossed the line first, yet I sensed the change in the atmosphere the moment our eyes met. It was perilous. Impulsive. It was a decision we should have never made. However, the moment had passed. The spark had already ignited. We did not engage in direct conversation. We were not required to. The atmosphere between us was charged. Overwhelming. His presence lingered in the room, palpable even from a distance. His gaze would rest on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His stare weighed down, brimming with untold stories. And I would feel an undeniable pull towards him. Even though every fiber of my being urges me to keep my distance. My heart raced at the mere proximity of him. The intensity of his focus sent a shiver of awareness across my skin. And I despised it. I despised the way he awakened a sense of vitality in me that had long been dormant. I loathed the way my body reacted to him, even as my mind shouted for me to retreat. Yet, I found myself unable to do so. His gaze held an unusual intensity that captivated me. It felt as though he possessed knowledge that was beyond my grasp. It felt as though he could peer directly into the depths of my being, uncovering the fragments of myself that I had hidden away for so long. And I was certain, beyond any question, that he wasn't merely pretending. Neither of us was engaged in the game. This was genuine. That understanding intensified the peril. I dedicated the evening to maintaining my poise. Struggling to concentrate on anything besides the rapid beating of my heart each time he was close. I reassured myself that it was insignificant. It was merely a fleeting oversight. Merely a fleeting moment. Yet, beneath the surface, I understood it wasn't true. It had already crossed the line. At this point, there was no way to retreat. It was never meant to occur once more. I had persuaded myself that I held the reins over it. I wished I could maintain my distance. Conceal my feelings deep within, hidden from the gaze of others. Yet, control is a delicate matter. When built on deception, it is destined to shatter. The subsequent occasion I encountered him, I was aware. The atmosphere changed even before he crossed the threshold. It wasn't merely the way he gazed at me, or the manner in which his body glided through the space. Yet, the palpable tension in the atmosphere drew us closer together. It felt as though an unseen power was pulling us closer. It had transformed into something deeper, a connection that transcended mere moments. This time, it was intentional. He understood my thoughts perfectly. And I understood his thoughts. The facade had finally crumbled. It's time to confront it head-on. It had intensified. We shared in the responsibility. Two eager individuals engaged in an affair that had transcended the limits of propriety. A palpable tension was rising within me. It feels like a weight building within me. A tightness in my gut that wouldn't let go. The allure. The yearning. The necessity. Everything blended into a perilous mix that obscured my clarity of thought. This feeling is not what I desired. I never intended to desire him. Yet, there was no way to retreat. As soon as we found ourselves in solitude, the pull between us became palpable. Silence enveloped the moment, leaving no words to be spoken. Are there no more games left to enjoy? His hand grazed my arm as he slipped by me. A gesture that was meant to be pure, yet turned out to be anything but. The space felt as though it were closing in. The atmosphere buzzed with expectation. It unfolded in an instant, leaving no room for contemplation. He stood before me. Our gazes intertwined, a silent connection forming between us. His breath was shallow. And then his lips met mine. Cozy. Immediate attention required. A kiss that encapsulated all the unspoken words between us. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to comprehend it. A brief instant that bore the significance of all that had transpired and all that was yet to come. I ought to have distanced myself. I ought to have put an end to it. I ought to have pushed him away and recalled what I truly possessed. The potential losses I face. However, I did not. Instead, I allowed myself to be drawn further into it. His hand settled on my waist. His touch was a vivid contrast to the chill that had taken residence in my heart. I found myself lost in uncertainty. I was unaware of my own identity. I was uncertain about where I stopped and he started. What I understood was that this sensation, was genuine. It was utterly captivating. The kiss ended. However, I chose to stay put. We lingered in that moment. Separated by inches. Silence enveloped us both. Neither of us required to. The realm beyond those four walls had vanished completely. The individuals residing within the dwelling. The lives we were meant to live. Everything blurred into insignificance as we found ourselves on the brink, balancing precariously on the edge of something that eluded our grasp. And that filled me with dread. I felt the urge to run. I felt the urge to pivot and leave. To wipe this from my existence and act as if it never occurred. Yet, as the thought crossed my mind, I realized it was already too late. The opportunity had slipped away. The line had already been crossed. It had already reached a point of no return. There was silence between us. There was no necessity for that. The truth could no longer be ignored. Enough with the facade. The quiet that enveloped us brimmed with unspoken comprehension. He remained silent, and I chose not to elaborate. What truly counted was that we had arrived. At this very instant. Trapped in a situation beyond our control. A whirlwind of thoughts clashed within my mind. What was the significance of this? What might unfold next? Would he attempt to advance further? Would I allow him? I was unaware. I was lost in the meaning of it all, yet I found myself unable to halt its course. I was powerless to intervene. As I exited the room, my heart racing in my ears, I came to a realization I had been avoiding for far too long. Turning back was not an option. This had transcended mere error. This was not an issue that could simply be brushed aside or forgotten. This was genuine. And it was unfolding. I played a role in it. Change was inevitable, it was just a question of when. The days after the kiss felt like a haze, but not in the way I had hoped. I had wished that the intense flood of feelings would subside, that I could neatly tuck it away and continue with my life as though nothing had occurred. However, the world operates differently. No matter how much I struggled to suppress it, it stubbornly refused to remain hidden. Nothing else came to mind. Every thought enveloped me, haunted by what had unfolded, by the sweetness of his lips, the heat of his touch, the intensity of his gaze. Even during moments shared with my husband, whether across the dinner table or lying beside him in bed, it was his image that filled my thoughts. His visage, his physique, the manner in which he enveloped me in a sensation that rendered the rest of the world non-existent in his presence. I attempted to put on a facade, naturally. I grinned at the appropriate moment. I chuckled when the discussion called for it. I navigated my days as though everything remained the same. Yet within, all had changed. There were instances when I found myself gazing at my husband, as though I were encountering him anew. I pondered whether he perceived the widening gap that was forming between us. He remained silent, and maybe he always would. He placed his trust in me, and I was meticulous in concealing any indication that all was not as it appeared. Yet, the reality was that circumstances had already changed. The fissures had begun to show, and despite my efforts to conceal them, I was acutely aware that they were only widening with time. I began to steer clear of him. My partner. It wasn't a lack of love for him, rather, my mind was consumed by thoughts of another man. The more I encountered him, the stronger the attraction became. It was unmissable. He lingered in every room I stepped into, woven into every conversation, occupying the distance between my husband and me. The kiss had evolved into something far more significant. It had transformed into a profound experience. It had transformed into an all-consuming fixation, a yearning that defied explanation. Whenever I caught sight of him, whenever our gazes intertwined, an undeniable spark surged between us, impossible to overlook. The contact, the instances of connection were growing more frequent, more profound. I despised it. I despised myself for permitting this to unfold, for allowing circumstances to spiral out of control as they did. Yet, each time I attempted to halt it, it seemed as though I was battling against a force far greater than myself. One evening, I stood before the mirror, gazing intently at my reflection. The woman staring back at me was almost unrecognizable. Who was she, really? What became of the woman who had found satisfaction in the life she had created? I possessed it all. Affection, safety, consistency. And yet, I sensed that I was unraveling at the edges. I found myself uncertain about what I sought. I found myself uncertain, wondering if I was anticipating a sudden realization, a flash of insight that would guide my next steps. However, I failed to grasp it. Instead, I observed an individual adrift, ensnared in a pattern of her own design. The following day, a message from him arrived. It was brief and straightforward, yet it stirred a wave of unease within me. He desired to meet. His request was unmistakable. There was no need for explicit words, and I understood that perfectly. We were both aware of the unfolding situation. I was filled with dread. Yet, concurrently, I sensed an additional feeling. There was a moment of pause before I crafted my reply. It was an insatiable longing, a craving, a necessity that I found impossible to overlook. I had ventured too far, and now retreat was impossible. I found myself unable to refuse. I was aware that I ought to step away and bring a conclusion to everything before it escalated any more. Yet, the reality was that I found myself unable to take that step. Not any longer. The words from him hung in my thoughts, tugging at me, murmuring temptations I understood I ought to dismiss. His desires were unmistakable, and it was even more evident that I shared those same yearnings. The understanding should have filled me with fear, yet it did not. Rather, it enveloped me in an unusual sense of expectation, a rush that quickened my heartbeat with each fleeting thought of it. The days drifted by, shrouded in a fog of unquiet musings. As I sat at home, solitude enveloping me, my husband occupied his time at work, and my thoughts drifted back to him. The way he gazed at me, the feel of his hand, and how my whole being reacted to him as if it had been taken over entirely. The urgency of the physical need consumed me, making it nearly impossible to concentrate on anything beyond it. However, I did not yield right away. I convinced myself that I had the power to manage it. I reassured myself that maintaining my distance was possible. I reassured myself that I could allow the sensation to fade, that it was merely a brief lapse, that it was nothing beyond a transient daydream. Yet, beneath the surface, I was aware of the reality. I found myself adrift. The gathering was unavoidable. The harder I attempted to stifle it, the stronger the attraction to him became. When I ultimately decided to meet, I reassured myself it was merely to address the underlying issues, to bring the tension into the light. Yet, as the words escaped my lips, I was acutely aware of the deception woven within them. I wasn't meeting him for a conversation. I wasn't meeting him to resolve anything. I was meeting him because I desired him. And that notion filled me with dread. As I entered the room where our meeting was set, a shift occurred that altered everything. The atmosphere around us felt dense, alive with the weight of our shared past and the anticipation of what lay ahead. The space seemed confined, the quiet surrounding us thick with things left unsaid. Initially, he remained silent. He remained motionless, observing me with eyes that were deep and piercing, as if he could peer right into my soul. The intensity of his stare pressed down on me, and for an instant, it felt as though the air had vanished. It felt as though all the truths I had been attempting to suppress surged forth all at once. I ought to have just turned on my heel and left. I ought to have departed at that moment, before the opportunity slipped away. Yet, I found myself moving nearer to him, compelled by an unexplainable, unseen pull. He extended his hand, with a nonchalant grace, gently sweeping a strand of hair away from my face. The sensation was charged, coursing through me like a live wire. I shut my eyes briefly, seeking a moment of calm. Yet, as I reopened my eyes, I found him leaning closer. I stood my ground. I was unable to. The kiss unfolded slowly, with intention, as if we were both relishing the moment that had been brewing between us for an eternity. The flavor of him was captivating, the heat of his form pulling me closer. It was perilous. It was audacious. It seemed as though nothing else held any significance. All that existed beyond those walls blurred into nothingness. The aftermath, the remorse, the deception. In that instant, everything was absent. Nothing else held significance, it was solely about him. Yet, as I sensed myself surrendering, I realized I was being drawn into an uncontrollable force. This was no ordinary matter. This transcended mere longing. It delved into a profound truth, one I had kept hidden from myself until this moment. I found myself ensnared in a web of my own design. At this moment, escape was impossible. As the kiss came to an end, I drew back, though just a fraction. We lingered in close proximity, our breaths coming in quick, heavy gasps. The quiet that enveloped us was heavy, burdened by all the unspoken words lingering in the air. He gazed at me differently than he had in the past. The questioning had ceased, and uncertainty was a thing of the past. At this moment, everything became evident. We were both aware of the unfolding events. And neither of us was prepared to bring it to an end. The snare had tightened its grip, leaving me uncertain about my desire to break free. I never thought it would reach this point. At first, when the instances were brief and easily overlooked, I told myself it was merely a transient infatuation, a fleeting misstep. Yet, with each fleeting look, each gentle touch, and every quiet moment shared, it evolved into something more profound. And now, poised at the brink of my own choices, I sensed the heavy burden of the outcomes bearing down upon me. I had traversed a boundary, one that I could not return from. Neither guilt nor regret could reverse the actions that had already taken place. I had surrendered. I found myself slipping into a situation I recognized as misguided. And now, the outcomes were unavoidable. The days following that meeting felt like a haze. I drifted among them, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts about him, reflecting on our past and pondering our future actions. Rest eluded me, my mind fixated solely on the intense desire to be close to him. Each second apart from him stretched into a seemingly endless span of time. Each moment I shared with him seemed to draw me further away from who I truly was. My husband remained unaware, just as he always had. He persisted in navigating his days, deeply engaged in his craft, his established rhythm. I fulfilled my role, feigning that all was well, while deep down I sensed myself gradually being devoured by the hidden truth I held from him. The trust reflected in his eyes, the love, only deepened the turmoil within me. It became increasingly difficult to meet his gaze, to maintain the facade that everything remained the same. I found myself trapped in a cycle I couldn't endure any longer, yet I was at a loss for how to break free. Every time I encountered him, the attraction seemed to intensify. The allure had evolved beyond mere physical attraction. It transcended the mere stolen kisses and the touches that rendered me breathless. It went beyond the surface. He possessed a grip on me, one that I found impossible to escape, regardless of my efforts. He occupied my thoughts, my emotions, and each time I laid eyes on him, it felt as though I was sinking deeper into the snare I had woven for my own heart. I attempted to divert my attention. I immersed myself in my tasks, dedicated myself to my everyday rituals, yet nothing seemed to help. Whenever I shut my eyes, he was all that filled my mind. Each time his voice reached my ears, each time his smile graced my sight, I felt an irresistible pull towards him, as if I were enchanted. Each time I laid eyes on my husband, a heavy guilt would descend upon me, pressing down like a stone in my chest, ready to suffocate me. I could no longer maintain the facade. I could no longer deceive myself or him. Yet, what other option was there? What might unfold if the truth were revealed? The weight of our actions was overwhelming. The deception, the treachery, the shattered faith. It would obliterate everything. It would shatter my marriage, my existence, and all that I have tirelessly crafted. I stood at a pivotal moment, caught between two existences, two realms. One was secure, known, and steady. The other was untamed, erratic, and perilous. At the heart of everything lay the decision I needed to confront. I pondered the consequences of revealing the truth to my husband. Could he grasp it? Can we progress beyond this? Or would it all fall apart? Will he be gone from my life for good? And then, there existed the contrasting perspective. The allure that beckoned me to surrender, to persist in what had begun, to release the burden of guilt and fully accept the longing. Yet, as time passed, a realization began to dawn on me. Regardless of the path I selected or the choices I faced, there was no turning back. Changes had already taken place. As I stepped over that threshold, I ignited a sequence of occurrences that spiraled beyond my control. The consequences loomed ahead, stealthily positioned just out of sight, poised to strike at any moment. The walls seemed to constrict around me, the burden of it all growing heavier with every day that went by. The more time passed with the secret hidden away, the more challenging it grew to prevent it from surfacing. Yet, I found myself unprepared to confront the reality. Not at this moment. Thus, I continued to navigate this dual existence, concealing my true self behind a facade of ordinary life, fully aware that this charade was not sustainable. Eventually, the truth would reveal itself. And when it finally arrived, I would have to confront the repercussions of my choices.